Some healing, some feasting, some fasting, and some working today on another episode of the Bible in 1 year with the preacher's husband. Today we're going through Mark chapter 2. Tomorrow we're going to do John chapter 5. So what does the Bible have in store for us today? All right, so chapter 2. This section in chapter 2 contains 4 different conflict stories that are relating to Jesus' authority. Now, in each of these, Jesus was accused of blasphemy. He was challenged about his association with sinners, and he was rebuked for neglecting religious customs, and even accused of breaking Sabbath laws. So here we are in chapter 2, verse 1. It says, when he entered Capernaum, it was reported that he was at home. At home. Well, this home actually probably refers to Peter's house, as we saw in chapter 1, verse 29 through 31. And this was Simon and Andrew's house both together. So it would have been a big home, since Simon, who is Peter, shared this with Andrew. And it was large enough to host Jesus and all of his followers. Now, archaeologists have actually identified such a house near the synagogue in Capernaum, if you want to look that up. They believe they found this actual house and that it existed. So when we get to verse 2, so many people gathered together that there was no more room. So it was a big house. It was cram-packed full and not even in the doorway. So they came bringing a paralytic, and since they were not able to carry him, they removed the roof and took the roof off and hoisted him down into the house, as you see here. Now, most houses in Palestine were single-story flat roof structures with an outside staircase. So there would have been stairs going up to the side, because the roof was actually used for work, drying laundry, sleeping if it's super hot outside or something at night, and even for prayer. So over the cross beams, there's pretty much small holes or branches were placed and covered with thatch and mud. So they dug through this to get this person down into the house. Now, rather than a word of healing, Jesus spoke forgiveness over the paralytic after addressing him as son. Now here, Jesus links sin and infirmity together. Now, possibly there was a direct relationship between this man's sins and paralysis, but we really don't know. You could only assume this. But the scribes here suppose that Jesus was blaspheming when he heard them declare the man's sin was forgiven, and death by stoning was the prescribed penalty for blasphemy. Keep in mind that it was the charge on which Jesus was eventually executed. It was blasphemy, the charge of blasphemy. So, after all of this, forgiveness of sin is a quality that cannot be checked against visual evidence. So anyone can claim to forgive sins, of course. So actually having the authority to do it, though, like Jesus had, was another thing altogether. So in order to prove his right to forgive sins, Jesus basically undertook the more verifiable, yet still pretty remarkable, task of healing this man. So he did. He healed this man. And that brings us to the Call of Levi. We've talked about this before, how essentially Jesus comes to Levi and says, follow me, and he gets up and follows him. He was man in a tow booth when all this happened, and he invites Jesus to his house, and they have a meal together, and they're having all these festivities going on, but it included notorious figures at this banquet, so to speak, though. Sinners and tax collectors. So sinners here refers to those who deliberately violate God's law. So they're deliberately being bad people. And by dining with such people, Jesus in some sense identified with them. Far from condoning their sins, though, Jesus dwelt among them because he had come to save sinners. Most scribes here were Pharisees, as it says here, the scribes who were Pharisees. Most scribes were Pharisees, and they strictly observed the written and oral laws, believed in angels and resurrection. They opposed Greek influence, and they were esteemed by the people, but they were constantly in conflict with Jesus, just as they are here. And when Jesus heard them question him about why he was eating with them, he said this. He said, "It is not those who are well who need a doctor, but those who are sick. I didn't come to call the righteous, but sinners." How interesting is that? That is amazing. So that brings us to the next question about fasting. Dun, 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 dun. And here is Jesus and the Pharisees. So, a question about fasting here. The question about fasting arose because the behavior of Jesus' disciples contrasted with those of the disciples who belonged to John the Baptist and the Pharisees' disciples. Fasting was only required on the Day of Atonement, though. If you look at the Bible, it was in Leviticus chapter 16, verse 29 and 30. But in the New Testament times that we're in now, the Pharisees fasted on Mondays and Thursdays pretty much every week, and it was just considered an act of piety. So it wasn't really written in the law that you had to fast during these days that they fasted. But to them, it was kind of a breaking of tradition, so to speak. And Jesus said to them, "Look, the wedding guests cannot fast while the groom is with them, can they? As long as they have the groom with them, they can't fast." Because here's the deal. A wedding typically lasted 7 days. And we talked about weddings previously. And basically, Jesus here is shifting the focus to his coming death when he says that the time will come when the groom will be taken away from them, and then they will fast on that day. So right now they're in the time of celebration, not a time of mourning or fasting. And both of these sayings here that come afterwards are Jesus's first parables. They're his first parables in Mark, in the book of Mark. And both of these sayings indicate the impossibility of integrating Jesus's teachings the new way with the religious structures and practices of traditional old Judaism, when he uses these parables about the brand new patch of unshrunk cloth. So a brand new piece of cloth that hadn't been washed yet. You patch it on an old pair of breeches or something where there's a hole. Well, once you wash it and dry it, of course, that patch is going to shrink up and it's going to tear things even worse. That's what he's talking about. When he talks about the wine skins, so when a wine skin is used, you put new wine in a new skin, and it ferments, and they ferment them into these skins, and then when they're done, they pour them out. Well, you can't use that skin again because when it dries, it becomes brittle. So if you put new wine in, that brittleness of the wine skin will soften just enough that it causes it to bust open and break. You'll lose all the wine. So they're basically, Jesus is saying these two ways are not going to mesh. They're just not, it's just not going to work here. And then we move to the Lord of the Sabbath. Here we go with that Sabbath again. We talked about this pretty much all the way through the Old Testament, but Sabbath to Jesus was a little different here than Sabbath to the Jews, now wasn't it? Now the controversy here was that they did these things on the Sabbath, a day of rest on which no work was permitted. And that was in Exodus chapter 20 and in Deuteronomy chapter 5. What they did was they basically picked some heads of grains, basically getting some grains so they can make themselves some bread. Well, you weren't supposed to do that on the Sabbath. You're supposed to do that before the Sabbath and prepare for it. Well, that's not what the disciples and Jesus did, and the Pharisees pretty much saw them doing that. And it was specifically forbidden in Jewish law. This truly was specifically forbidden. But in verses 25 and 26 here, though, Jesus defended his disciples by appealing to David's flight from King Saul that we talked about in 1 Samuel chapter 21, verses 1 through 6. In the time of Abiathar here, as the high priest, was kind of a peculiarity, so to speak. It was, Mark said that it was in this time, but this is debated because this event actually happened when Abiathar's father, Ahimelech, was the high priest. However, Abiathar was the only high priest to escape Saul's slaughter of the priests, and he was very well known throughout David's era. So Mark's reference here to him is pretty fitting to the approximate time period of when it happened. The bread that he stole, that David stole, would have been the bread that was, it would have been 12 loaves of bread is essentially what it would have been, and it would have represented the 12 tribes, and it was the bread that was placed in the temple's holy place that only the priest could eat. So basically, he stole this bread and he ate it. But Jesus declared that David's actions here were technically a violation of Old Testament law, but they weren't necessarily condemned, right? He didn't condone it, but at the same time, he didn't condemn him for it because, well, they were doing this to survive. And then, of course, here we are in verse 27 and 28. And Mark alone recorded Jesus' declaration about God's priorities regarding the Sabbath and humans here, when he told them the Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath. So then the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. Now when you talk about Sabbath, people question, they say, I don't know about this, Sunday's a Sabbath day. Well, it never was until later on. Actually, the Sabbath that the Bible speaks about is Saturday, or the seventh day, because it's a reflection of God created through 6 days, and on day 7 he rested. And the Jews, they have always considered a day to be from sunset on one day to the sunset of the next day. So that would be what a day is. So the night belongs to the day that it follows, contrary to our concept of the night belonging to the day that it follows, right? So the night belongs to the day that follows it. So essentially, they've always observed their Sabbath from Friday evening when the sun goes down until Saturday evening when the sun goes down. Now, Jesus did observe the Sabbath. People read this and think, wow, Jesus didn't observe the Sabbath, so why should I? But he did. In Luke chapter 4 that we just read, verse 16, he actually did. He went to the synagogue and he read and he worshiped on the Sabbath just like everyone else. But he never did suggest a change to Sunday. He did, however, reject a strict legalistic interpretation of the Old Testament commandment about observing the Sabbath. And he said Sabbath observance was not a duty that mankind owed to God. Rather, Jesus says here that God made the Sabbath as a day of rest for mankind's benefit. So take advantage of that on the Sabbath. God said what you're supposed to do on the Sabbath. You're supposed to rest. That's what the word means anyway. And you're supposed to recover. You're supposed to recuperate. And you're supposed to worship Him. So whatever day you take as your Sabbath, take your Sabbath. Just make sure that you rest up on that day and make sure that you worship Him for it. Now, I hope this has helped you in your studies. If it has, click the like button, subscribe button, and of course, click the little jingle bell so you get notified the next time I upload a video, which will be tomorrow, for another episode of the Bible in 1 Year with the Preacher's Husband. We'll see you then.